Al Jazeera, Paris.
To discuss more about the violence and controversy spurred by these attacks, I'd like to welcome Robert McFadden, the Senior Vice President of the Soufan Group and a Deputy Assistant Director of U.S. Counterintelligence Operations, and John Bowen, Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis, who's joining us now from St. Louis. Gentlemen, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Thomas, for having me.
Great to be here.
Mr. McFadden, I want to start with you. And as we try to answer these critical questions here, the motives, the affiliation, do you see the divide between Islam and the West deepening?
In some respects, yes. When you have situations like this, the tendency is to, and most unfortunately, but naturally, to conflate a lot of situations. And really not taking a more nuanced look. There are certain sets of circumstances and context for what's going on in France that may or not apply to England or Germany or the United States, pick your area of the world. So it also speaks to a much broader strategic issue, though, too. Sometimes it seems like a cliche, but truly the shrinking global village that we have, that issues that happen in some parts of the world over religious differences, or let's say philosophically, can seem to have that effect in just about everywhere else in the world.
Mr. Bowen, I'll ask it in this manner as well. Are we not connecting the right dots and truly understanding the factors behind this and other attacks?
Well, I think first of all, I agree completely with both the last two comments. I think it is important to connect the dots in a way that reminds us that France, Britain, and the U.S. each have very different histories of encounters with Islam. One thing people don't often point out is the long, intimate engagement that France has had with the Muslim world. Since 1830, when they invaded Algeria, there have been many millions of French people in Algeria and thousands coming to France after World War II to work. It's those immigrants and their children and grandchildren who ended up in those poor parts of France around Paris, in Lyon, in the north, without jobs and without a feeling of connection to French society. And what we see in France is a strong sense of not really being welcomed into the Republic. It has nothing to do with religion. It's a sense of exclusion, of discrimination. You know, it reminds me much more of what happens in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few miles from where I'm sitting, where African Americans feel excluded, not welcomed into the society. And for that large number of French Muslims, it's not about religion, it's about this sense that they're treated as second-class citizens.
So it's not about theology, it's about alienation and resentment?
For those people it is, yeah. The vast majority of French Muslims who feel like they're not really accepted, it's about resentment and alienation, yes.
I want to talk about two words that we've heard often this week, Mr. McFadden, that is lone wolf, the lone wolf element. How does one become radicalized?
Well, it really depends on where you're talking about, who you're talking about. I mean, we certainly have seen an increased volume of lone wolf or wolf pack incidents. You know, small groups, we use as definition wolf pack of less than 5. But again, though, it's important for looking at them individually. Now, the common thread, of course, is violence. Violence as the only means to address known or perceived grievances. But when you take a look at some of the recent incidents, like in Canada, for example, at the War, the Veterans Memorial, you can't deny that individual had some serious mental pathology as well as chronic drug addiction. You take a look at what happened in Australia with that tragic event with the hostage situation. There you had another individual that may have had the veneer of some kind of religious grievance, but there were many other underlying things. Look what happened in France in the tragedy over the last 72 hours. Now here you have a situation, from what we know so far and so much more information to come, where you had at least 2 brothers that were homegrown, self-radicalized, that bought into that violent ideology, which is the driver in some of these cases of violence. Not so much the group affiliation as the most important thing, but buying into, on the Sunni extremist side anyway, the Salafi Takfiri ethos, where there's no other way to think or act but that way, no negotiation. So that can be the driver in some of these cases, but not all.
Looking at the video we saw just a moment ago outside Charlie Hebdo, what does that tell you from a security standpoint, the actions of these men?
From the security standpoint, as far as the attack?
As far as training, as far as calculated movements.
Yeah, you know, there was a lot of assessment right after the event, looking at the video, where some experts from law enforcement pointed out the high degree of training, precision, military tactical movements. But then on the other end of the spectrum, some other experts said, look, you know, it really may exhibited a cursory amount of training. But nonetheless, there was training, there was practice, and there was egress, which is different than some of the other recent terrorist events where you can tell the assaulters felt that there was no escape plan. They were going to go down in a hail of bullets or blow themselves up. So you had that. But here's something consistent, though, Thomas, and usually the small-scale lone wolf or wolf pack attacks, even with preparation. Although there may have seemed astute planning on the getaway, it follows a script that after the event, it's what do we do now? So these brothers obviously had no real plan. They probably thought they could either hide in plain sight or go underground. And of course, with the great capability of French service supported by allies, that wasn't going to happen.
We'll talk more about that. But though, looking at the Muslim community, Mr. Bowen, how does France stand out from other countries in regards to immigration?
In regards to immigration, well, there's what I mentioned earlier, that France has the largest number of Muslims of any European country, and it's had these great problems of separation and exclusion of these Muslims from the rest of society. Another thing that's specific about France, though, compared to Britain and Germany, say, is that France never really left its former colonies. It's maintained a very strong and intricate and intimate, indeed, economic, political, and military engagement with former French colonies and former protectorates. So they've got troops on the ground in Mali. They took a lead in bombing in Libya. That wasn't a former colony, but they felt the need to get involved. And they've been involved in bombing in Iraq, and they've discussed involvement in Syria. And this is another aspect of the problem. It means that from the standpoint of jihadis fighting in Iraq and Syria, if America is the #1 enemy, well, maybe France is #2. You saw this, by the way, in the, or you heard it in the audio clip of the guy who held up and took hostages in the kosher grocery store. He talked about, unlike the brothers, he talked about the ways in which French forces are killing brothers and sisters in Iraq and Syria.
Does it become more complicated now that we're seeing these radicalized forces competing for power in the Middle East?
That would be Mr. McFadden's area, I think.
All right, Mr. McFadden, I'll turn to you.
I'd be glad to. In the short answer is yes. Okay, because some of the theory, and I emphasize theory right now, with the claim of responsibility or that it was its operation, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and connected to Al-Qaeda core. You had this competition, this vying for primacy as the vanguard of the Sunni extremist movement. So I think it's a plausible scenario that could at least explain why AQAP was so quick to claim responsibility or say it was its operation. So, but regardless of how that shakes out, that competition for recruits, for being #1, for maybe making the biggest impact, definitely is something of concern for allies.
How difficult is it to track these sleeper cells?
Extraordinarily. Now, when you talk about bigger organizations, let's say Al-Qaeda as it existed in the aftermath of 9/11 to the mid-2000s, just by the number of nodes of communication, for example, opportunities to either exploit the different things it does is bigger, is more facilitated for intelligence and security services. But when you have an individual or a very small cell, as in France, although that's another topic to talk about, the missed opportunities, let's say, for the French service and how it handled that, it makes it just extraordinarily difficult to penetrate through human sources. And then you have a situation in various countries, and we'll take France again, where it has a really quite a big issue chronically for a number of years now, being able to not just find a needle in the haystack, but the many, many, many different haystacks.
Do you feel the French are overextended?
The French have worked with the French, know the French well, very good capability at the local, the state, the national level, works well with allies, with us, has a terrific capability. However, if the French were not at capacity or over capacity, I'd really be surprised. If you take just one issue, okay, and there are many issues within France domestically, the foreign fighter numbers. Official estimates as of the spring, 700 French young men had gone to Syria, some to Iraq. At this point, at least 1,000 have gone. Government estimates in France, at least 225 have returned to the country. I mean, that just kind of paints the picture of following, tracking. Why did they go? What's their motivation? What are they up to when they come home? How challenging that is.
Mr. Bowen, what is the conversation, if you want to add to that, the conversation we should be having moving forward across the world and here at home?
Yes, I'd like to add, pick up on this question of radicalization and the lone wolf idea. And this is absolutely right, but sort of upstream from this, there are many more young French women and men who are getting radicalized. They go on the internet, they get attracted by the message. The message is the French don't love you, and the French are over here killing your brothers and sisters in Islam, so come join us. And that might be 2,000, 3,000, we don't really know. The second element to this is, of course, radicalization in the prisons. This was the case with one of the two brothers, but it's been the case for many, many more. So this suggests two areas of intervention going forward that need to be thought out carefully. One is, what kind of steps can be made upstream from somebody leaving to fight or get trained in Iraq or turning into someone who's going to commit a violent act? What are the ways in which community leaders, parents, others, teachers can mobilize or be mobilized earlier on to cut short this circuit? And then secondly, what's going to happen in prisons? Are there ways to break up assemblies? Are there ways to intervene earlier on? France faces a great shortage of Muslim chaplains. It's not a tradition in Islam to have chaplains, and France has been trying to train more and more people who can come in knowing Arabic, knowing Islam, well trained in the religion, but also trained in how to deal with prisoners and how to recognize dangers very early on. So those are two things I think that need to be worked on.
Very important points. I want to take a look at a tweet that's creating dialogue on social media. It's by business and media magnate Rupert Murdoch. And he tweeted about the attacks. He says, maybe most Muslims are peaceful, but until they recognize and destroy their growing jihadist cancer, they must be held responsible. He followed with a second tweet that reads, big jihadist dangers looming everywhere from Philippines to Africa to Europe to U.S. Political correctness makes for denial and hypocrisy. I want to point out that News Corps did not respond to our request for comments. As we debate free speech expression, how should a comment like this be dissected? I'll start with you, Mr. Bowen.
Well, I have two reactions right off. The notion that Muslims should somehow be responsible as a group, as a billion people, for the actions of a small handful of misguided radicals is laughable. You know, are Christians responsible for the People's Army in Central Africa when it commits atrocities in the name of Christianity? Clearly not. Are all Buddhists responsible for Buddhist attacks on Muslims in Myanmar? Again, clearly not. Now, that said, it's true that there's a lot to be done within the Muslim community in terms of educating Muslims about what Islam really says, about the intricacies of Islam. In fact, Mark Sageman, another counterterrorism expert in the U.S., former CIA guy, I think, once said in one of his books, Leaderless Jihad, that one of the things Europe ought to do is have many, many more Islamic schools to train young Muslim men and women about what Islam is. The problem is, these young men and women know nothing about Islam. They've not been schooled in it. You know, a couple of the terrorists recently, at another occasion, were found to be carrying with them the book Islam for Dummies and the Quran for Dummies because they were on their way to Iraq. They knew nothing about the religion. They felt they better bone up on something.
Mr. McFadden, your final thoughts.
Yeah, Mr. Bowen put it so wonderfully. I couldn't agree with any more than he said. With the statement, though, the first very first word I think was maybe most Muslims, or I think any reasonable objective look that overwhelmingly most Muslims are not for the violent ethos whatsoever. But the other part of what we're talking about here that you know, as a former practitioner now in private industry, but working in the Near and Middle East for many years, great privilege, there's an idea again of making a monolith of where it never existed and never will. And the statement talks about from Africa to the Middle East to the Philippines. When, going back to what I said originally, it's so important to take a look at the circumstances locally in the country and regionally. Okay, because what's going on, for example, in northeast Nigeria with the Boko Haram situation is certainly many more contrast than what's going on with Abu Sayyaf and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines. So, but the importance there is wherever we're talking about, it's an ideology that fills a void. where, if you can imagine, in many countries of even the Arab Spring, for young men and women, they have two non-alternatives: autocratic dictatorship governments or religious extremism, and not in between. So those are the kind of things, not so much we're going to be able to do or solve, of course, in the United States or the West, but within many of those societies and countries, that transformation, reformation, some say, is the longer term, is where progress will be made.
A lot of questions remain. As we take a step back, we'll have to leave it there. Robert McFadden, Senior Vice President of the Soufan Group and a Deputy Assistant Director of U.S. Counterintelligence Operations, and John Bowen, Professor of Sociocultural Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Gentlemen, great to have you with us on
Thank
A
you,
Deeper
Tom.
Look. No problem.
Thanks very much.